At the family dinner, my greddy daughter-in-law called me a stupid old woman. You're going to ruin the company. I smiled and placed one of my diplomas on the table. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The chandelier cast a warm glow over the dining table as I smoothed the wrinkles from my navy dress, the one I'd bought specifically for family dinners. Everyone was gathered around the mahogany table that had witnessed 20 years of family celebrations and disagreements. My son Richard sat at the head, where my late husband once did, with Hazel, my daughter-in-law, positioned strategically at his right. "More wine, Mom?" Richard offered, holding up the bottle of Merlot I'd brought, a good vintage from my small collection. I nodded, smiling as I extended my glass. The dinner had been pleasant so far, dominated by discussions about my grandchildren's school achievements and neighborhood gossip. But I knew it wouldn't last. These family dinners never stayed peaceful, not since Harold passed away 3 years ago. So, Hazel cleared her throat, placing her fork down with deliberate precision. "Richard told me you visited the office yesterday, Francis." The table fell silent. My son suddenly became very interested in his plate of roast chicken. "Yes, I," replied simply. "I wanted to check on the quarterly projections. Some of the numbers didn't quite add up in the reports." Hazel's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. "You know, Francis, Richard has everything under control. The company has never been more profitable." "I'm sure he does," I said, taking a sip of wine. "I just noticed that the Henderson account seemed off by about 30,000. It's probably nothing." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I told you I'd look into it. And I'm sure you will, dear." I smiled at my son, the boy who used to run to me with skinned knees and homework questions. Now 42, with strands of gray at his temples that reminded me so much of his father. Hazel's laugh cut through the air, sharp, practiced, patronizing. "Francis, with all due respect, the business world has changed dramatically since your day. We use advanced software now, not ledgers and calculators." My daughter-in-law had never worked a day at Holloway Manufacturing. She'd been a real estate agent when she met Richard, and now her only connection to our family business was through marriage. Yet somehow she'd appointed herself an authority. "Technology changes," I agreed mildly. "Numbers don't." "Mom has years of experience," my daughter Lisa interjected from across the table. "She ran the financial department for over 20 years. Hazel's smile tightened. "Yes, back when the company was a quarter of its current size." I said nothing, just cut another piece of chicken. Harold and I had built Holloway Manufacturing from a small workshop into a respectable mid-sized company. After his death, I'd stepped back to let Richard take control, staying on only as a consultant. It was what Harold would have wanted. "I'm just concerned about the company," I said. "It's our family legacy." "Oh, for God's sake," Hazel muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. She turned to Richard. "This is exactly what I was talking about. Your mother can't let go." "Hazel," Richard warned, but his voice lacked conviction. She ignored him, locking eyes with me. "Francis, you need to trust that the next generation can handle things. You're constant, hovering. It's not helping anyone." The table fell silent. Even the children stopped eating, sensing the tension. "I'm not hovering, Hazel. I'm advising." Hazel rolled her eyes, turning to the table at large as if seeking allies. "This is what happens when people can't accept retirement. They become bitter, clinging to whatever relevance they once had." My grandson Tommy, only 12, looked up with wide eyes. "But Grandma built the company with Grandpa." "Tommy, eat your dinner," Hazel snapped. I reached for my wine glass, my hand steady despite the burn in my chest. 3 years of these subtle digs had built up a certain immunity. "The truth is," Hazel continued, her voice rising with each word, "your interference is becoming a liability. The board doesn't need an old woman who can't use a computer questioning every decision. Hazel, Lisa gasped. No, it needs to be said. Hazel's eyes were bright with vindication. We've all been thinking it. You're just a relic, Francis. A well-meaning, but ultimately ignorant old woman who's going to break the company if we let you keep meddling. The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Richard stared at his plate, a muscle twitching in his jaw but no defense forthcoming. My grandchildren looked between the adults with confusion and discomfort. I carefully placed my napkin beside my plate and stood up. Without a word, I walked to the hallway where I'd left my purse. Inside was the folder I'd brought to show Richard, the documentation of the accounting discrepancies I'd found, along with my diploma from Wharton Business School that I'd planned to photocopy for the new company brochure. I returned to the table, where uncomfortable silence reigned. With deliberate calm, I placed my diploma on the table, right next to Hazel's wine glass. MBA, class of 1983, summa cum laude, I smiled gently. I think I'll head home now. Thank you for dinner. As I walked to the door, I heard Lisa's chair scrape back. Mom, wait. But I was already closing the door behind me, the cool evening air a welcome relief against my burning cheeks. In my car, I finally allowed my hands to shake, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to scream. But I was done being silent. The morning after the disastrous dinner, I sat on my porch swing, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. My coffee had gone cold, forgotten in my hands as memories washed over me like waves, relentless and unavoidable. It hadn't always been this way with Richard and me. Before Hazel, before Harold's death, we'd been close. I remembered him as a little boy sitting beside me at the kitchen table while I reviewed invoices, his small fingers tracing the columns of numbers. One day all this will be yours, I'd told him. But I want to work with you and Dad, he'd replied, his eyes bright with childish certainty. The phone rang, pulling me from my reverie. Lisa's name flashed on the screen. Mom, I'm so sorry about last night, she said immediately. Hazel was completely out of line. It's all right, dear. No, it's not. Richard should have said something. I gave him hell after you left. I smiled despite myself. Lisa had always been my defender, even as a child. How are you feeling? She asked softly. I'm fine, I said automatically, the response worn smooth by years of use. Just disappointed. Truth was more complicated. Harold's death 3 years ago had left a void not just in my heart but in the family structure. He'd been the buffer between Richard and me, smoothing over our occasional disagreements with his easy charm. Without him, the cracks had started to show. Richard's coming over later to apologize, Lisa informed me. Is he? Or are you making him? Her silence was answer enough. After we hung up, I went inside and pulled out an old photo album. There we were, Harold and I on the day we signed the lease for our first workshop. I was 26, hair pulled back in a sensible bun, wearing my best dress and a determined expression. Harold stood beside me, tall and confident, his arm around my waist. We'd been equal partners from the start. He was the visionary, the one who could charm investors and clients alike. I was the pragmatist, handling finances and operations with careful precision. Together, we built Holloway Manufacturing into something we were proud of. When the children came along, I stepped back from day-to-day operations but still kept the books, working late into the night after the kids were asleep. Richard and Lisa grew up watching both their parents pour everything into the business. The doorbell rang at noon precisely. Richard stood on my doorstep, looking uncomfortable in the way men do when forced to apologize. Hi, Mom, he said, shifting his weight. From one foot to the other, I stepped aside to let him in. Would you like some coffee? Sure. In the kitchen, I poured him a cup, adding the splash of cream he'd preferred since college. We sat at the small table by the window, the silence stretching between us like a physical thing. "Lisa says I need to apologize," he finally said. "For what exactly?" I kept my voice neutral. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, just like his father used to. "For not stepping in when Hazel was speaking to you that way." "And do you think you should have?" Richard stared into his coffee cup. "It's complicated." "Mom." "It always is." I took a sip of my coffee. "When did it become acceptable for your wife to speak to me that way, Richard?" "She's under a lot of pressure at work." "Hazel doesn't work at Holloway," I pointed out gently. "No, but she hears about it all the time. The stress comes home with me." I nodded, understanding all too well. Harold had brought the weight of the company home many nights. The difference was, I'd been there to help carry it. The discrepancies I found in the Henderson account are real, I said, changing the subject. "Someone's been cooking the books, Richard." His face closed off immediately. "Mom, I told you I'd handle it." "When?" "It's been 3 weeks since I first brought it to your attention." "You don't understand how busy things are right now. We're in the middle of the Miller acquisition." I raised an eyebrow. "The Miller acquisition? Since when?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "It's recent, very preliminary." Something wasn't right. The Millers had been our competitors for years. Harold had always said their operation was too inefficient to consider acquiring. Whose idea was this acquisition? "The board's," Richard said too quickly. "Look, Mom, I appreciate your concern, but I've got this under control." I'd heard those words so many times over the past 3 years. After Harold's funeral, when Richard insisted on taking full control, when he replaced our longtime CFO with his college friend, when he started excluding me from board meetings. "Your father and I built that company from nothing," I said quietly. "I've earned the right to be concerned." Richard's expression softened. "I know, Mom, and I value your input. I really do. But times have changed. The business is different now." What he meant was, you're different now. Older, less relevant. A relic, as Hazel had so cruelly put it. After Richard left, I sat alone in my kitchen, the familiar ache of isolation settling in my chest. The company had been my life's work, my identity for over 30 years. Now I was being pushed aside, my concerns dismissed, my experience devalued. I thought about the diploma I'd left on the table. MBA, class of 1983, summa cum laude. I'd fought so hard for that degree, studying nights while working days, one of only 7 women in my class. Harold had been so proud when I graduated, telling everyone his wife was the brains of the operation. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "How did it go with Richard?" "As expected," I replied. There was no point burdening her with the details. I walked to my home office, a small room overlooking the garden. On the bookshelf sat row after row of leather-bound ledgers, the company's financial records from our first 20 years, before everything went digital. Beside them, neatly organized folders contained copies of every major contract, business plan, and financial statement. Harold used to tease me about my paper fortress, but he understood. Information was power, and I'd never believed in leaving power solely in others' hands. I pulled out the most recent company reports, the ones I'd managed to obtain before being quietly removed from the email distribution lists. Something wasn't adding up, and it wasn't just the Henderson account. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Tommy, my grandson, holding his math textbook. "Hi, Grandma," he said with a shy smile. "Mom said you could help me with my algebra?" I smiled genuinely this time. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in." As we settled at the dining room table, I pushed the company problems aside. Tommy opened his textbook, and I felt a surge of gratitude for this simple connection. "Grandma," he said, hesitantly, "is it true what Mom said? That you and Grandpa built the whole company yourselves?" "We did, I confirmed. From the ground up. Tommy frowned, pencil tapping against his book. Then why does Mom say you don't understand how it works anymore? Out of the mouths of babes. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes people mistake experience for outdated thinking. But math, I tapped his textbook. Math never changes. The principles stay the same, even when the problems get more complex. Tommy nodded, seemingly satisfied. As we worked through his equations, I felt a resolve hardening inside me. I'd been silent too long, stepping back to keep the peace, watching from the sidelines as my life's work was slowly taken from me. It was time to change the equation. 2 weeks passed after the dinner incident. Richard had stopped taking my calls, responding only with brief texts, claiming he was swamped with work. I'd grown accustomed to this pattern: confrontation, followed by withdrawal, then a gradual return to strained politeness. But something felt different this time. I was pruning my roses when Lisa pulled into my driveway, her face tight with worry. "Dad's office is being cleared out," she announced without preamble. I put down my garden shears. "What do you mean?" "Richard's ordered everything moved to storage. All of Dad's files, his awards, even the photos from his desk." Lisa ran a hand through her hair. "I only found out because Marjorie called me." Marjorie had been Harold's secretary. For 20 years, she'd stayed on after his death, one of the few old guards still at the company. Did Richard say why? "He needs the space for the new executives from Miller." "Mom, what's going on with this acquisition? It seems rushed." I invited Lisa inside, my mind racing. As I made tea, she sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. "Look at this," she said, pushing her phone toward me. On the screen was a business news article. Holloway Manufacturing in talks for surprise acquisition of Miller Industries. The article quoted an anonymous source close to the deal, saying the acquisition would revitalize Holloway's outdated business model. My stomach clenched. Harold had always said Miller's operation was inefficient, their products inferior. Why would Richard want to acquire them? "Richard hasn't told me anything about this," I admitted. Lisa's expression darkened. "Hazel seems very involved. Marjorie said she's been coming to all the meetings." That was unusual. Hazel had no official role at the company. After Lisa left, I sat in my garden, turning over these new developments in my mind. Something wasn't right. I needed to see those files before they disappeared into storage. The next morning, I dressed with care in a tailored navy suit, my armor for the corporate world. I drove to Holloway Manufacturing, the building Harold and I had purchased 20 years ago when we outgrew our original location. The security guard smiled in recognition. "Mrs. Holloway, haven't seen you in a while." "Hello, Frank. Just stopping by to pick up some of Harold's things." He waved me through without question. I still had my access card, though I rarely used it anymore. The office was busier than I remembered, with unfamiliar faces hurrying through the corridors. No one stopped me as I made my way to Harold's old office, now Richard's. Outside, Marjorie's. Desk was empty, but her computer was on. I knocked on the office door. No answer. Taking a deep breath, I used my key, the one Richard didn't know I still had. The office had changed. Harold's dark wooden desk had been replaced with a sleek glass one. The family photos were gone, except for one of Richard and Hazel on their wedding day. Along the wall, boxes were stacked, labeled HH Archives. I began searching through them, looking for anything related to the Miller Company or the Henderson account. In the third box, I found Harold's personal notebooks, the ones he'd used to jot down thoughts and observations about the business. The most recent one was dated just a month before his heart attack. I flipped through it, scanning his familiar handwriting. On one page, a name jumped out. P. Miller approached again, re-sale, declined. Operation too leveraged, product line outdated. P. Miller, Paul Miller, the founder's son who now ran Miller Industries. He had wanted to sell to us, not the other way around, and Harold had declined. I continued searching and found a folder labeled Confidential Board Minutes. Inside were records of meetings from the past year, meetings I should have been invited to as a major shareholder, but wasn't. As I read, my hands began to shake. The board, now stacked with Richard's friends, had approved a series of decisions that made no business sense. They'd shifted manufacturing of our most profitable product lines to cheaper, lower-quality processes. They'd approved raises and bonuses for the new executives while freezing wages for long-term employees. And most alarmingly, they'd authorized Richard to pursue the acquisition of Miller Industries at any reasonable cost. But the final blow came when I found a draft of the acquisition agreement. There, in black and white, was the truth. This wasn't an acquisition. It was a merger that would effectively dissolve Holloway Manufacturing as we knew it. The new company would operate under the Miller name, with Holloway becoming a subsidiary brand. Our company, the one Harold and I had built from nothing, the legacy we'd created for our children, would cease to exist. And there, listed as a special advisor to the transition, was Hazel. With a proposed compensation package that made my blood boil, I was so engrossed in the documents that I didn't hear the door open. "Mom? What are you doing here?" I looked up to see Richard standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "I came to see what's happening to your father's things," I said calmly, despite the storm raging inside me. But I found something much more interesting. I held up the acquisition agreement. Richard's face paled. "You shouldn't be going through confidential documents," he said stiffly. "Confidential? From me? I own 30% of this company, Richard. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you're selling your father's legacy to a company he specifically refused to do business with." I stood up, facing my son directly. "And it looks like your wife is profiting handsomely from the deal." Richard's jaw tightened. "The board approved everything. It's all above board. The board you appointed after pushing out your father's oldest friends and colleagues." I shook my head. "What happened to you, Richard? This company was supposed to be your inheritance, not something to dismantle and sell off. You don't understand modern business, Mom. We need to evolve." "Evolve? Yes. Self-destruct? No." I gathered the documents I'd found. "I'm taking copies of these. As a major shareholder, I have every right to review them." Richard stepped forward. "You can't." "I can and I will." I met his gaze steadily. "Your father would be heartbroken." A flash of something, guilt perhaps, crossed his face before hardening again. "Don't bring Dad into this, he's not here." "No," I agreed sadly. "But I am, and I'm not going anywhere." As I walked past him, my head held high despite the weight in my heart, Richard called after me. "Mom, don't do anything rash. Let me explain." I paused at the door. "I'm done listening to explanations, Richard. From now on, I'll be watching what you do, not what you say." Driving home, the documents secure beside me, I felt a curious mix of devastation and determination. The company Harold and I had built with our sweat and dreams was being dismantled by our own son. And for what? Money? Status? Or was he simply being manipulated by Hazel and her ambitions? It didn't matter. What mattered was that I finally understood what I was up against. The insults, the dismissals, the efforts to push me aside. They weren't just about me. They were about erasing everything Harold and I had built together. As I pulled into my driveway, I made a decision. I'd been silent long enough. It was time to fight for Harold's legacy. And my own. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, surrounded by the documents I'd taken from Richard's office, a legal pad filled with notes beside me. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through my curtains, I had formulated a plan. not a plan of confrontation or public accusation that would only drive Richard further into his defensive stance and potentially damage the company. No, I needed to be strategic, subtle. I needed to play the long game, just as Harold and I had done when building the business. My first call was to Walter Green, our family attorney for over 30 years. He'd semi-retired after Harold's death, but still handled my personal affairs. "Francis?" he greeted warmly. "What a pleasant surprise. I need your advice, Walter, and your discretion." We arranged to meet for lunch at a small cafe across town, away from any prying eyes. Walter arrived precisely on time, as he always did, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit impeccable despite the summer heat. After ordering, I carefully explained what I'd discovered. Walter's bushy eyebrows drew together as he examined the documents. "This is troubling, Francis. Very troubling indeed. Can they do this? Sell the company without my consent?" He sighed, removing his glasses. "With the current board composition and Richard's voting shares combined with his allies, they can approve the merger. However," he tapped the papers, "there are irregularities here that concern me. The valuation seems artificially low, and this compensation arrangement for non-employees," he pointed to Hazel's name, "could be seen as self-dealing." "What can I do?" Walter considered for a moment. "A direct legal challenge would be messy, public, and could damage the company's value. But there are other approaches." He leaned forward. "You still have allies at Holloway, I presume?" I thought of Marjorie, of Jack in production who'd been with us for 25 years, of Patricia in accounting who'd always respected my financial acumen. "Yes," I nodded. "Not on the board, but in key positions." "Good. And you mentioned discrepancies in the Henderson account, among others. I've been keeping notes." Walter smiled slightly. "You always were thorough, Francis. Harold used to say you could spot a penny missing in $1 million budget." The mention of Harold sent a pang through my heart. What would he do in this situation? He'd be strategic, I realized. Patient, but persistent. He wouldn't burn bridges. He'd build new pathways. After lunch, I made 2 more calls. The first was to Patricia in accounting, inviting her to tea the following day. The second was to James Henderson himself, one of our oldest clients and a dear friend of Harold's. "Francis!" James's booming voice filled the line. "Where have you been hiding yourself? I've missed seeing you at the company events." "I've been keeping a low profile," I said carefully. "James, I need to ask you something about your account with us." Anything for Harold's wife. "Have there been any unusual communications from Holloway recently? Any changes to your service agreement or pricing?" A pause. "Funny you should ask. We received notice last month that our rates would be increasing by 15%. When I called to discuss it with Richard, he said it was a market adjustment. I nearly took our business elsewhere, but for Harold's sake, I gave it another month." I made a note. "Thank you, James. One more thing. Would you be willing to meet with me, unofficially? For you, Francis, name the time and place. Over the next week, I met with key people, quietly, carefully, away from the office." Patricia confirmed my suspicions about the accounting irregularities, providing me with copies of the original documents. James Henderson introduced me to 2 other long-term clients who shared similar stories of rate hikes and service reductions. Jack, from production, revealed that quality control standards had been quietly lowered to cut costs. "The new management doesn't understand our reputation was built on quality, not price," he said bitterly. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, another ally to my silent coalition. I was careful never to criticize Richard directly or to reveal my ultimate intentions. I simply listened, asked questions, and collected information. Meanwhile, I reconnected with my old business network. Lunches with former colleagues, coffee with industry friends, even a golf game with Edward Simmons, the president of the Regional Business Association who had always respected Harold and me. Retirement doesn't suit you, Francis, Edward observed as we walked the course. You've got that look in your eye again. The one you had when you and Harold were expanding into the Western markets. I smiled. I'm just keeping busy. He lined up his putt. Heard some interesting rumors about Holloway. Merger with Miller? Seems an odd match. You know how rumors are, Edward. He sank his putt and straightened. I also know that Holloway Manufacturing was built on integrity and quality. Be ashamed to see that change. He gave me a meaningful look. If you ever need support from the association, you just say the word. By the third week of my silent campaign, I had amassed a considerable dossier. Financial documents showing irregularities, testimonials from concerned employees and clients, evidence of the board's procedural violations, and a clear picture of how the Miller merger would dismantle everything Harold and I had built. But I still needed more, particularly about Hazel's involvement. Her name had appeared on too many documents for someone with no official role at the company. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Lisa called one evening, her voice tight with excitement. Mom, you won't believe what Tommy found on Hazel's laptop. Lisa, I cautioned, we shouldn't involve the children in this. He wasn't snooping intentionally. He needed to print his homework, and Hazel's laptop was open. There were emails, Mom, between Hazel and Paul Miller, dating back months before Dad died. My heart raced. What kind of emails? Tommy only saw a few before Hazel came back, but he said they were talking about the plan and patience, and how the old guard needs to move on. I felt cold all over. Had Hazel been plotting this even while Harold was alive? Lisa, tell Tommy not to mention this to anyone, not even Richard. Of course, but Mom, what are you going to do? I looked at the organized files spread across my dining room table, the foundation of my counteroffensive. I'm going to save our company, I said simply. The following day, I received an unexpected visitor. Marjorie, Harold's former secretary, stood on my doorstep, clutching her purse nervously. Mrs. Holloway, I hope I'm not intruding. Marjorie, please, come in. And it's Frances, remember? She perched on the edge of my sofa, declining tea. I can't stay long. Richard doesn't know I'm here. What's wrong? They've set the date for the board vote on the Miller merger, 2 weeks from now. She twisted her hands in her lap. And there's something else. I found these in the shredding bin. She pulled a manila envelope from her purse and handed it to me. Inside were fragments of documents that had been torn rather than properly shredded. Draft agreements between Hazel and Paul Miller, dated 8 months earlier. The terms outlined Hazel's role as a consultant to Miller Industries after the merger, with a compensation package that made my blood boil. I pieced them together as best I could, Marjorie explained. I knew something wasn't right. I squeezed her hand. Thank you, Marjorie. You've taken a risk coming here. She straightened her shoulders. Mr. Holloway would have done the same for me. He always said you were the heart and brains of the company, Frances. We haven't forgotten. After she left, I added these new documents to my growing collection. The pieces were falling into place. Now I needed to make my move before the board vote, carefully, strategically, without revealing my hand too soon. That evening, I received a text from Richard. Family dinner this Sunday. Please come, Mom. We need to talk. I stared at the message, wondering what had prompted this sudden olive branch. Was it genuine reconciliation, or did he suspect I was up to something? Either way, I knew what I had to do. I texted back a single word. Yes. The stage was set, the players were in position, and I was done being silent. Sunday dinner at Richard and Hazel's house felt like walking into a carefully staged play. The table was set with Hazel's best china, fresh flowers arranged in the center, soft classical music playing in the background. Too perfect. Too controlled. Mom, Richard greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I'm glad you came. Hazel appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron over her designer dress, a domestic touch that seemed calculated rather than natural. "Francis," she nodded, her tone carefully civil. "Dinner's almost ready." The children were noticeably absent. "Where are Tommy and Emma?" I asked. "Sleep over at a friend's?" Hazel replied quickly. "We thought it would be good for us adults to talk without interruptions." Of course they did. I settled into the dining room, accepting the glass of wine Richard offered. Lisa arrived moments later, giving me a meaningful look as she sat beside me. She'd been my confidant throughout this ordeal, the only family member I'd fully trusted with my discoveries and plans. Once we were all seated and the first course served, Richard cleared his throat. "Mom, I wanted to talk to you about the company." I took a small bite of salad. "I'm listening." "I know you've been concerned about some of the changes we're making, but I want to assure you that everything we're doing is for the long-term benefit of Holloway Manufacturing." "Including the merger with Miller Industries?" I asked mildly. Richard's fork paused midway to his mouth. He exchanged a quick glance. "With Hazel. You know about that. I make it my business to know what's happening to the company your father and I built." Hazel gave a tight smile. "It's a strategic alliance, Francis. Miller has distribution channels we need, and we have the manufacturing capability they lack. It makes perfect business sense." "Does it?" I sipped my wine. I seem to recall Harold specifically declining Paul Miller's offer to merge just months before he died. The atmosphere in the room shifted, tension crackling like static electricity. "Dad was old school," Richard said dismissively. "He didn't see the potential synergies." "What my son means," I corrected gently, "is that your father recognized Miller's inferior product quality and over-leveraged balance sheet as liabilities, not assets." Hazel's smile vanished. "With all due respect, Francis, the business landscape has changed dramatically since Harold's day. Richard understands the modern market." "Does he? Or does he simply understand what you and Paul Miller have convinced him is true?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably beside me. Richard's face darkened. "Mom, if you've come here just to criticize..." "I've come because you invited me," I reminded him, "and because, despite everything, you're my son and I love you." This seemed to catch him off guard. His expression softened slightly. "Then trust me on this, Mom. The merger is happening. The board votes next week, and it's going to pass." I nodded slowly. "Yes, I imagine it will. Unless, of course, something changes their minds." Richard narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Hazel frowned, clearly not expecting anyone else. "I'll get it." She returned moments later, her face pale. "It's Edward Simmons and James Henderson. They say they have a meeting with Francis." Richard turned to me, confusion etched on his features. "Mom, what's going on?" I stood up, smoothing my skirt. "I invited a few people to join our discussion. I hope you don't mind." "Here? Now?" Hazel's voice rose an octave. "This is completely inappropriate." "What's inappropriate," I said calmly, "is scheming behind my back to dismantle the company Harold and I built. What's inappropriate is cutting me out of decisions affecting my 30% ownership stake." Richard stood up as well, his face flushed. "You had no right." "I had every right," I corrected him. "As a major shareholder, as your father's widow, and as someone who knows exactly what's happening with the Miller merger." I walked to the foyer where Edward and James waited, along with Patricia from accounting, and, to my surprise, 3 members of the Holloway Board of Directors, all people I'd quietly contacted over the past weeks. "Thank you all for coming," I greeted them. Richard and Hazel were just about to explain the details of the Miller merger. We moved to the living room, which suddenly seemed too small for the tension filling it. Richard stood rigid by the fireplace, Hazel beside him, her arms crossed defensively. Lisa quietly slipped in behind the newcomers, positioning herself near the door. Francis has raised some concerns about the proposed merger, Edward began smoothly, his years as association president evident in his diplomatic tone. As longtime supporters of Holloway Manufacturing, we thought it prudent to discuss them directly. This is an ambush, Hazel snapped. No, dear, I corrected gently. This is a board meeting. Informal, perhaps, but necessary given the circumstances. 3 board members doesn't constitute a quorum, Richard pointed out stiffly. True, I acknowledged. But they can certainly relay information to their colleagues before the official vote. I opened my portfolio and distributed copies of the documents I'd collected, the financial discrepancies, the questionable decisions, the evidence of Hazel's involvement with Paul Miller dating back to before Harold's death. What is this? Demanded Gregory Phillips, the newest board member and usually Richard's staunch ally. Evidence, I said simply, of self-dealing, conflicts of interest, and actions contrary to the company's welfare. Richard's face had gone from flushed to ashen. Mom, you can't do this. I already have. I turned to the board members. The merger with Miller isn't a strategic alliance. It's a carefully orchestrated takeover that will ultimately dismantle Holloway Manufacturing and line certain individuals' pockets at the expense of the company's legacy, employees, and shareholders. Patricia stepped forward, her accounting ledgers in hand. I've documented systematic financial manipulations designed to devalue Holloway's assets and inflate Miller's worth. James Henderson followed. And I can attest to the deliberate alienation of long-term clients through unjustified price increases and service reductions. One by one, my carefully cultivated allies presented their evidence. The board members listened with increasingly troubled expressions, occasionally glancing at Richard, whose defensive posture had gradually deflated into something resembling defeat. Hazel, however, remained defiant. This is absurd. You're just a bitter old woman who can't accept that the company has moved beyond you. I smiled at her calmly. Is that why you've been coordinating with Paul Miller since before my husband died? Planning to push me out and remake the company in your image? Her eyes widened. You can't prove that. Actually, I can. I handed the board members copies of the reconstructed documents Marjorie had salvaged from the shredder, along with emails Tommy had glimpsed on Hazel's laptop. Emails I'd managed to obtain through other channels. Gregory Phillips studied the documents, his frown deepening. If these are authentic, they represent a serious breach of fiduciary duty. They're authentic, I assured him. And there's more where that came from. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Richard stared at the floor, shoulders slumped. Hazel looked as though she might shatter with rage at any moment. Edward Simmons cleared his throat. I think, given these revelations, the board might want to reconsider its position on the Miller merger. And perhaps, added board member Elaine Foster, review the current management structure as well. Richard finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since our guests arrived. In his gaze, I saw a complex mixture of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something else. Relief, perhaps? Had he been in over his head all along, manipulated by Hazel and Paul Miller, unable to find a way out? What do you want, Mom? He asked, quietly. I stepped toward my son, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the weariness in his eyes. I kept my voice low, meant for him alone. I want what your father would have wanted. For you to lead with integrity, not deception. For Holloway to remain the company we built, one that values quality, loyalty, and family. He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. The board members began discussing next steps among themselves. Lisa moved to stand, beside me, squeezing my hand in silent support. Edward Simmons approached with a satisfied nod. Impressive, Francis. Harold would be proud. I watched as Richard stepped away from Hazel, who remained frozen by the fireplace, her carefully constructed plans crumbling around her. The battle wasn't over. There would be formal meetings, votes, potentially legal proceedings. But in this moment, in this room, I had reclaimed my voice. And everyone had heard it, loud and clear. 3 months after that fateful Sunday dinner, I sat in what had once been Harold's office, now mine again, at least temporarily. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting a warm glow over the space I'd reclaimed. I'd brought back Harold's old desk, his leather chair, and the family photos that had been relegated to storage. Not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of our foundations. The door opened and Richard entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He'd lost weight in recent months, the strain of our family's upheaval evident in the new lines around his eyes. But there was something else there too, a clarity, a sense of purpose I hadn't seen in years. "Black, 2 sugars," he said, placing 1 cup on my desk. I remembered. "Thank you." I accepted the coffee, noticing how he lingered, clearly wanting to talk. "Sit down, Richard. How was your meeting with the Henderson team?" He settled into the chair across from me. "Good. Better than good, actually. They've agreed to a 5-year contract renewal at the original rates. James said it was because of the return to Holloway quality standards." I nodded, pleased but not surprised. Over the past 3 months, we'd been systematically rebuilding what had nearly been destroyed. Client relationships, employee trust, the company's reputation for integrity. The Miller merger had been unanimously rejected by the board once they understood the full picture. Paul Miller had threatened legal action, then quietly retreated when faced with the evidence of his collusion with Hazel. He'd found another struggling company to prey upon, and good riddance to him. "How are things at home?" I asked carefully. Richard's expression tightened. "Divorce proceedings are moving forward. Hazel's attorney is still pushing for company shares as part of the settlement." "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. "No," he agreed. "The prenup is solid. Walter made sure of that." We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our coffee. So much had changed, yet some wounds were still raw, some conversations still difficult. "Tommy asked if he could stay with you this weekend," Richard said finally. "He misses you." I smiled, warmth spreading through my chest. My grandson had been my most enthusiastic supporter throughout this ordeal, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his grandma had saved the company. The innocence of children, seeing in black and white what adults complicated with shades of gray. I'd love to have him. Lisa mentioned Emma might join us too. Richard nodded, then set his cup down with deliberate care. "Mom, about the CEO position." I held up a hand. "The board will make their decision next week. Whatever happens, I'll support it." After the failed merger and the revelation of Richard's missteps, the board had placed him on administrative leave pending a full review. I'd stepped in as interim CEO, stabilizing the company while they decided its future leadership. "I've been thinking," Richard continued, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe I'm not ready to be CEO. Not yet." I studied my son's face, seeing in it echoes of the earnest boy who had once sat beside me at the kitchen table, learning to balance ledgers. "What are you thinking instead?" "Operations director, working under you or whoever the board appoints as CEO. Learning the parts of the business Dad tried to teach me, the parts I thought I already knew." I felt a swell of pride, not because he was stepping back, but because he was finally being honest with himself. "I think that's very wise, Richard." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Harold's that it made my heart ache. "I let her get in my head, Mom. Hazel. She made me believe that Dad's ways, your ways, were outdated, that I needed to be bolder, more aggressive to prove myself. We all want to make our own mark," I said gently. "Your father understood that. He would have given you room to lead in your own way, but not at the expense of the company's soul." Richard nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. I miss him. Every day I find myself wondering what Dad would do, what he would say. So do I admitted. But we have to find our own answers now. A knock at the door interrupted us. Lisa peeked in, smiling when she saw us together. Sorry to interrupt, but the design team is ready for the presentation. I gathered my notes and stood, smoothing my jacket. We'll be right there. As Lisa disappeared down the hall, Richard lingered, something still unspoken between us. Mom, he began hesitantly. I never properly apologized. For the things Hazel said at that dinner, for not defending you, for everything that happened after. No, I agreed. You didn't. He winced at my directness. I'm sorry, truly. I was wrong, and I was weak. I rounded the desk and placed a hand on his shoulder. You were misled. It happens to the best of us. The question is, what have you learned? That integrity matters more than appearances. That experience has value. That family isn't just about blood. It's about trust and respect. He met my eyes directly. That you were always smarter than I gave you credit for. I smiled, squeezing his shoulder before releasing it. Now that's an apology I can accept. We walked together to the conference room where the design team waited with their proposals for a new product line, one that would honor Holloway's tradition of quality while incorporating innovative materials. The room fell silent as we entered, all eyes on me. 3 months ago, most of these people would have overlooked me completely or treated me with condescending patience. Now they waited for my approval, my guidance. Not because I'd seized power or demanded recognition, but because I'd earned their respect through consistent, quiet competence. The presentation was excellent, thorough, creative, mindful of both tradition and innovation. Exactly what I'd asked for. When it concluded, I thanked the team sincerely. This is precisely the direction Holloway needs to move in, I told them, honoring our foundations while building for the future. As the meeting dispersed, Edward Simmons approached. He'd become a regular presence at the company, lending his considerable influence to help rebuild Holloway's reputation in the business community. The board meeting is set for Monday, he informed me. They'll announce the permanent CEO appointment then. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I'll be ready for whatever they decide. Edward smiled knowingly. It's hardly a suspenseful vote, Francis. Your leadership these past months has been transformative. I accepted his compliment with a gracious nod, but the truth was more complex. If the board offered me the CEO position permanently, I wasn't certain I would accept. I had steadied the ship, yes, but perhaps it was time for new hands on the wheel, the right hands, guided by the right principles. Later that afternoon, I left the office early, something I rarely did. I drove to the cemetery where Harold was buried, bringing fresh flowers for his grave as I did every month. You should see the company now, Harold, I said softly as I arranged the blooms. It's thriving again. Richard is finding his way back. The legacy we built together is secure. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, the only response I would ever get. I didn't need more. Harold had always believed in me, had always seen me as his equal partner, even when others dismissed me as just the wife. In honoring our company, I honored him. As I drove home, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. Whatever the board decided on Monday, whatever role I played going forward, I had reclaimed what mattered most, my voice, my dignity, my rightful place in the legacy Harold and I had built together. My phone rang, the car's Bluetooth displaying Tommy's name. I answered with a smile in my voice. Hello, sweetheart. Grandma, Dad says I can stay with you this weekend. Can we make those special pancakes for breakfast? And can I help in your garden? And maybe you can teach me more about the company? I think I want to work there someday, like you and Grandpa. I laughed, his enthusiasm washing over me like a warm wave. Yes to all of that. I'll pick you up after school on Friday. Awesome. Oh, and Grandma? I told my friend Jake about how you stood up to Dad, and that mean Hazel. He says you're a total badass. Tommy! I tried to sound scandalized, but couldn't help laughing. That's not appropriate language. But it's true, he insisted. You didn't yell or break things or anything. You just showed everyone how smart you are and made them listen. That's way more badass than being loud, out of the mouths of babes. Well, when you put it that way, I conceded, still chuckling. After we hung up, I drove the rest of the way home with a smile on my face. At my house, I changed into comfortable clothes and went out to my garden, where the roses Harold had given me for our 30th anniversary were in full bloom. Resilient, beautiful things, surviving season after season with the right care. As I tended to them, pruning away the dead parts to make room for new growth, I thought about the journey of these past months. I had never sought power or revenge. I had simply refused to be erased, refused to let what Harold and I built be dismantled by greed and short-sightedness. In the end, it wasn't my diplomas or my business acumen that had saved Holloway Manufacturing. It was my silence, not the silence of submission, but the powerful silence of someone who observes, plans, and acts with deliberate purpose. The silence that commands respect, not by demanding it, but by earning it. Some might call it wisdom. I simply called it survival. And now, surrounded by the flowers my husband had planted, looking forward to a weekend with my grandchildren and a future secured for the company we'd built, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge a simple truth. I had not just survived, I had flourished. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.